Chapter 7 of The Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 7. The Village of Grassley-in-the-Hole. At about 1:30, under a strong blue sky, Turnbull got up out of the grass and fern in which he had been lying, and his still intermittent laughter ended in a kind of yawn. "I'm hungry," he said shortly. "Are you?" "I have not noticed," answered MacIan. "What are you going to do?" "There's a village down the road, past the pool," answered Turnbull. "I can see it from here. I can see the whitewashed walls of some cottages and a kind of corner of the church. How jolly it all looks. It looks so—I don't know what the word is—so sensible. Don't fancy I am under any illusions about Arcadian virtue and the innocent villagers. Men make beasts of themselves there with drink, but they don't deliberately make devils of themselves with mere talking. They kill wild animals in the wild woods, but they don't kill cats to the god of victory. They don't—" He broke off and suddenly spat on the ground. "Excuse me," he said. "It was ceremonial. One has to get the taste out of one's mouth." "The taste of what?" asked MacIan. "I don't know the exact name for it," replied Turnbull. "Perhaps it is the South Sea Islands, or it may be Magdalen College." There was a long pause, and MacIan also lifted his large limbs off the ground, his eyes particularly dreamy. "I know what you mean, Turnbull," he said, "but—I always thought you people agreed with all that about doing as one likes, and the individual, and nature loving the strongest, and all the things which that cockroach talked about." Turnbull's big blue-grey eyes stood open with a grave astonishment. "Do you really mean to say, MacIan," he said, "that you fancied that we, the free thinkers, that Bradlaugh or Holyoake or Ingersoll, believe all that dirty, immoral mysticism about nature? Damn nature!" "I supposed you did," said MacIan calmly. "It seems to me your most conclusive position." "And you mean to tell me," rejoined the other, "that you broke my window and challenged me to mortal combat, and tied a tradesman up with ropes, and chased an Oxford fellow across 5 meadows, all under the impression that I am such an illiterate idiot as to believe in nature?" "I supposed you did," repeated MacIan with his usual mildness. "But I admit that I know little of the details of your belief—or disbelief." Turnbull swung round quite suddenly and set off towards the village. "Come along," he cried. "Come down to the village. Come down to the nearest decent inhabitable pub. This is a case for beer." "I do not quite follow you," said the Highlander. "Yes, you do," answered Turnbull. "You follow me slap into the inn parlour. I repeat, this is a case for beer. We must have the whole of this matter out thoroughly before we go a step farther. Do you know that an idea has just struck me of great simplicity and of some cogency. Do not by any means let us drop our intentions of settling our differences with 2 steel swords. But do you not think that with 2 pewter pots we might do what we really have never thought of doing yet, discover what our difference is?" "It never occurred to me before," answered MacIan with tranquillity. "It is a good suggestion." And they set out at an easy swing down the steep road to the village of Grassley-in-the-Hole. Grassley-in-the-Hole was a rude parallelogram of buildings, with 2 thoroughfares which might have been called 2 high streets if it had been possible to call them streets. One of these ways was higher on the slope than the other, the whole parallelogram lying aslant, so to speak, on the side of the hill. The upper of these 2 roads was decorated with a big public house, a butcher's shop, a small public house, a sweetstuff shop, a very small public house, and an illegible signpost. The lower of the 2 roads boasted a horse pond, a post office, a gentleman's garden with very high hedges, a microscopically small public house, and 2 cottages. Where all the people lived who supported all the public houses was in this, as in many other English villages, a silent and smiling mystery. The church lay a little above and beyond the village, with a square grey tower dominating it decisively. But even the church was scarcely so central and solemn an institution as the large public house, the Valencourt Arms. It was named after some splendid family that had long gone bankrupt, and whose seat was occupied by a man who had invented a hygienic bootjack. But the unfathomable sentimentalism of the English people insisted in regarding the inn, the seat, and the sitter in it, as alike parts of a pure and marmoreal antiquity. And in the Valencourt Arms festivity itself had some solemnity and decorum, and beer was drunk with reverence, as it ought to be. Into the principal parlor of this place entered two strangers, who found themselves, as is always the case in such hostels, the object, not of fluttered curiosity or pert inquiry, but of steady, ceaseless, devouring ocular study. They had long coats down to their heels, and carried under each coat something that looked like a stick. One was tall and dark, the other short and red-haired. They ordered a pot of ale each. "MacIan," said Turnbull, lifting his tankard, "the fool who wanted us to be friends made us want to go on fighting. It is only natural that the fool who wanted us to fight should make us friendly. MacIan, your health." Dusk was already dropping, the rustics in the tavern were already lurching and lumbering out of it by twos and threes, crying clamorous good nights to a solitary old toper that remained, before MacIan and Turnbull had reached the really important part of their discussion. MacIan wore an expression of sad bewilderment not uncommon with him. "I am to understand, then," he said, "that you don't believe in nature." "You may say so in a very special and emphatic sense," said Turnbull. "I do not believe in nature, just as I do not believe in Odin. She is a myth. It is not merely that I do not believe that nature can guide us, it is that I do not believe that nature exists." "Exists?" said MacIan in his monotonous way, settling his pewter pot on the table. "Yes, in a real sense nature does not exist. I mean that nobody can discover what the original nature of things would have been if things had not interfered with it. The first blade of grass began to tear up the earth and eat it. It was interfering with nature, if there is any nature. The first wild ox began to tear up the grass and eat it. He was interfering with nature, if there is any nature. In the same way," continued Turnbull, "the human, when it asserts its dominance over nature, is just as natural as the thing which it destroys." "And in the same way," said MacIan almost dreamily, "the superhuman, the supernatural, is just as natural as the nature which it destroys." Turnbull took his head out of his pewter pot in some anger. "The supernatural, of course," he said, "is quite another thing. The case of the supernatural is simple. The supernatural does not exist." "Quite so," said MacIan in a rather dull voice. "You said the same about the natural. If the natural does not exist, the supernatural obviously can't." And he yawned a little over his ale. Turnbull turned for some reason a little red and remarked quickly, "That may be jolly clever for all I know. But everyone does know that there is a division between the things that as a matter of fact do commonly happen and the things that don't. Things that break the evident laws of nature—" "Which does not exist," put in MacIan sleepily. Turnbull struck the table with a sudden hand. "Good Lord in heaven!" he cried. "Who does not exist," murmured MacIan. "Good Lord in heaven!" thundered Turnbull, without regarding the interruption. "Do you really mean to sit there and say that you, like anybody else, would not recognize the difference between a natural occurrence and a supernatural one, if there could be such a thing? If I flew up to the ceiling—" "You would bump your head badly," cried MacIan, suddenly starting up. "One can't talk of this kind of a thing under a ceiling at all. Come outside and ascend into heaven." He burst the door open on a blue abyss of evening, and they stepped out into it. It was suddenly and strangely cool. "Turnbull," said MacIan, "you have said some things so true and some so false that I want to talk, and I will try to talk so that you understand. For at present you do not understand at all. We don't seem to mean the same things by the same words." He stood silent for a second or two, and then resumed. "A minute or two ago I caught you out in a real contradiction. At that moment logically I was right, and at that moment I knew I was wrong. Yes, there is a real difference between the natural and the supernatural. If you flew up into that blue sky this instant, I should think that you were moved by God, or the devil. But if you want to know what I really think, I must explain." He stopped again, abstractly boring the point of his sword into the earth, and went on. "I was born and bred and taught in a complete universe. The supernatural was not natural, but it was perfectly reasonable. Nay, the supernatural to me is more reasonable than the natural. For the supernatural is a direct message from God, who is reason. I was taught that some things are natural and some things divine. I mean that some things are mechanical and some things divine. But there is the great difficulty, Turnbull. The great difficulty is that, according to my teaching, you are divine." "Me divine?" said Turnbull truculently. "What do you mean?" "That is just the difficulty," continued MacIan thoughtfully. "I was told that there was a difference between the grass and a man's will, and the difference was that a man's will was special and divine. A man's free will, I heard, was supernatural." "Rubbish," said Turnbull. "Oh," said MacIan patiently, "then if a man's free will isn't supernatural, why do your materialists deny that it exists?" Turnbull was silent for a moment. Then he began to speak, but MacIan continued with the same steady voice and sad eyes. "So what I feel is this. Here is this great divine creation I was taught to believe in. I can understand your disbelieving in it, but why disbelieve in a part of it? It was all one thing to me. God had authority because he was God. Man had authority because he was man. You cannot prove that God is better than a man. Nor can you prove that a man is better than a horse. Why permit any ordinary thing? Why do you let a horse be saddled?" "Some modern thinkers disapprove of it," said Turnbull a little doubtfully. "I know," said MacIan grimly. "That man who talked about love, for instance." Turnbull made a humorous grimace. Then he said, "We seem to be talking in a kind of shorthand, but I won't pretend not to understand you. What you mean is this, that you learnt all about your saints and angels at the same time as you learnt about common morality from the same people in the same way. And you mean to say that if one may be disputed, so may the other. Well, let that pass for the moment. But let me ask you a question in turn. Did not this system of yours, which you swallowed whole, contain all sorts of things that were merely local, the respect for the chief of your clan, or such things, the village ghost, the family feud, or what not? Did you not take in those things, too, along with your theology?" MacIan stared along the dim village road, down which the last straggler from the inn was trailing his way. "What you say is not unreasonable," he said, "but it is not quite true. The distinction between the chief and us did exist, but it was never anything like the distinction between the human and the divine, or the human and the animal. It was more like the distinction between one animal and another. But—" "Well?" said Turnbull. MacIan was silent. "Go on," repeated Turnbull. "What's the matter with you? What are you staring at?" "I am staring," said MacIan at last, "at that which shall judge us both." "Oh, yes," said Turnbull in a tired way. "I suppose you mean God." "No, I don't," said MacIan, shaking his head. "I mean him." And he pointed to the half-tipsy yokel who was ploughing down the road. "What do you mean?" asked the atheist. "I mean him," repeated MacIan with emphasis. "He goes out in the early dawn. He digs or he ploughs a field. Then he comes back and drinks ale, and then he sings a song. All your philosophies and political systems are young compared to him. All your hoary cathedrals, yes, even the eternal church on earth is new compared to him. The most mouldering gods in the British Museum are new facts beside him. It is he who in the end shall judge us all." And MacIan rose to his feet with a vague excitement. What are you going to do?" "I am going to ask him," cried MacIan, "which of us is right." Turnbull broke into a kind of laugh. "Ask that intoxicated turnip–eater?" he began. "Yes, which of us is right?" cried MacIan violently. "Oh, you have long words and I have long words, and I talk of every man being the image of God, and you talk of every man being a citizen and enlightened enough to govern. But if every man typifies God, there is God. If every man is an enlightened citizen, there is your enlightened citizen. The first man one meets is always man. Let us catch him up." And in gigantic strides the long, lean Highlander whirled away into the grey twilight, Turnbull following with a good–humoured oath. The track of the rustic was easy to follow, even in the faltering dark, for he was enlivening his wavering walk with song. It was an interminable poem, beginning with some unspecified King William, who, it appeared, lived in London town and who after the second rise vanished rather abruptly from the train of thought. The rest was almost entirely about beer, and was thick with local topography of a quite unrecognizable kind. The singer's step was neither very rapid, nor indeed exceptionally secure, so the song grew louder and louder, and the two soon overtook him. He was a man elderly, or rather of any age, with lean grey hair and a lean red face, but with that remarkable rustic physiognomy in which it seems that all the features stand out independently from the face; the rugged red nose going out like a limb, the bleared blue eyes standing out like signals. He gave them greeting with the elaborate urbanity of the slightly intoxicated. MacIan, who was vibrating with one of his silent, violent decisions, opened the question without delay. He explained the philosophic position in words as short and simple as possible. But the singular old man with the lank red face seemed to think uncommonly little of the short words. He fixed with a fierce affection upon one or two of the long ones. "Atheists," he repeated with luxurious scorn. "Atheists! I know their sort, master. Atheists! Don't talk to me about 'un. Atheists!" The grounds of his disdain seemed a little dark and confused, but they were evidently sufficient. MacIan resumed in some encouragement. "You think as I do, I hope. You think that a man should be connected with the Church, with the common Christian—" The old man extended a quivering stick in the direction of a distant hill. "There's the church," he said thickly. "Ghastly old church that is. Pulled down it was, in the old squire's time, and—" "I mean," explained MacIan elaborately, "that you think that there should be some one typifying religion, a priest—" "Priests!" said the old man with sudden passion. "Priests! I know 'un. What they want in England? That's what I say. What they want in England?" "They want you," said MacIan. "Quite so," said Turnbull, "and me, but they won't get us. MacIan, your attempt on the primitive innocents does not seem very successful. Let me try. What you want, my friend, is your rights. You don't want any priests or churches. A vote, a right to speak, is what you—" "Who says I ain't got a right to speak?" said the old man, facing round in an irrational frenzy. "I got a right to speak. I'm a man, I am. I don't want no votin' nor priests. I say a man's a man, that's what I say. If a man ain't a man, what is he? That's what I say, if a man ain't a man, what is he? When I sees a man, I says 'e's a man." "Quite so," said Turnbull, "a citizen." "I say he's a man," said the rustic furiously, stopping and striking his stick on the ground. "Not a city or aught else. He's a man." "You're perfectly right," said the sudden voice of MacIan, falling like a sword. "And you have kept close to something the whole world of today tries to forget. Good night." And the old man went on wildly singing into the night. "A jolly old creature," said Turnbull. He didn't seem able to get much beyond that fact that a man is a man. "Has anybody got beyond it?" asked MacIan. Turnbull looked at him curiously. "Are you turning an agnostic?" he asked. "Oh, you don't understand," cried out MacIan. "We Catholics are all agnostics. We Catholics have only in that sense got as far as realizing that man is a man. But your Ibsens and your Zolas and your Shaws and your Tolstoys have not even got so far." End of chapter 7. Recording by Trisha G. Of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 8. An Interlude of Argument. Morning broke in bitter silver along the grey and level plain, and almost as it did so Turnbull and MacIan came out of a low, scrubby wood on to the empty and desolate flats. They had walked all night. They had walked all night and talked all night also, and if the subject had been capable of being exhausted, they would have exhausted it. Their long and changing argument had taken them through districts and landscapes equally changing. They had discussed Heckel upon hills so high and steep that in spite of the coldness of the night it seemed as if the stars might burn them. They had explained and re-explained the massacre of St. Bartholomew in little white lanes walled in with standing corn as with walls of gold. They had talked about Mr. Kensit in dim and twinkling pine woods amid the bewildering monotony of the pines. And it was with the end of a long speech from MacIan, passionately defending the practical achievements and the solid prosperity of the Catholic tradition, that they came out upon the open land. MacIan had learnt much and thought more since he came out of the cloudy hills of Arisaig. He had met many typical modern figures under circumstances which were sharply symbolic, and, moreover, he had absorbed the main modern atmosphere from the mere presence and chance phrases of Turnbull, as such atmospheres can always be absorbed from the presence and the phrases of any man of great mental vitality. He had at last began thoroughly to understand what are the grounds upon which the mass of the modern world solidly disapprove of her creed, and he threw himself into replying to them with a hot intellectual enjoyment. "I begin to understand one or two of your dogmas, Mr. Turnbull," he had said emphatically as they ploughed heavily up a wooded hill. "And every one that I understand I deny. Take any one of them you like. You hold that your heretics and skeptics have helped the world forward and handed on a lamp of progress. I deny it. Nothing is plainer from real history than that each of your heretics invented a complete cosmos of his own which the next heretic smashed entirely to pieces. Who knows now exactly what Nestorius taught? Who cares? There are only two things that we know for certain about it. The first is that Nestorius, as a heretic, taught something quite opposite to the teaching of Arius, the heretic who came before him, and something quite useless to James Turnbull, the heretic who comes after. I defy you to go back to the free thinkers of the past and find any habitation for yourself at all. I defy you to read Godwin or Shelley or the deists of the 18th century of the nature-worshipping humanists of the Renaissance without discovering that you differ from them twice as much as you differ from the Pope. You are a 19th century skeptic, and you are always telling me that I ignore the cruelty of nature. If you had been an 18th century skeptic, you would have told me that I ignore the kindness and benevolence of nature. You are an atheist, and you praise the deists of the 18th century. Read them instead of praising them, and you will find that their whole universe stands or falls with the deity. You are a materialist, and you think Bruno a scientific hero. See what he said, and you will think him an insane mystic. No, the great free thinker, with his genuine ability and honesty, does not in practice destroy Christianity. What he does destroy is the free thinker who went before. Free thought may be suggestive, it may be inspiriting, it may have as much as you please of the merits that come from vivacity and variety, but there is one thing free thought can never be by any possibility. Free thought can never be progressive. It can never be progressive because it will accept nothing from the past. It begins every time again from the beginning, and it goes every time in a different direction. All the rational philosophers have gone along different roads, so it is impossible to say which has gone farthest. Who can discuss whether Emerson was a better optimist than Schopenhauer was pessimist? It is like asking if this corn is as yellow as that hill is steep. No, there are only two things that really progress, and they both accept accumulations of authority. They may be progressing uphill and down, they may be growing steadily better or steadily worse, but they have steadily increased in certain definable matters. They have steadily advanced in a certain definable direction. They are the only two things, it seems, that ever can progress. The first is strictly physical science. The second is the Catholic Church. Physical science and the Catholic Church, said Turnbull sarcastically, and no doubt the first owes a great deal to the second. If you pressed that point, I might reply that it was very probable, answered MacIan calmly. I often fancy that your historical generalizations rest frequently on random instances. I should not be surprised if your vague notions of the Church as the persecutor of science was a generalization from Galileo. I should not be at all surprised if, when you counted the scientific investigations and discoveries since the fall of Rome, you found that a great mass of them had been made by monks. But the matter is irrelevant to my meaning. I say that if you want an example of anything which has progressed in the moral world by the same method as science in the material world, by continually adding to without unsettling what was there before, then I can say that there is only one example of it, and that is us. With this enormous difference, said Turnbull, that however elaborate be the calculations of physical science, their net result can be tested. Granted that it took millions of books I never read and millions of men I never heard of to discover the electric light. Still I can see the electric light. But I cannot see the supreme virtue which is the result of all your theologies and sacraments. Catholic virtue is often invisible because it is the normal, answered MacIan. Christianity is always out of fashion because it is always sane, and all fashions are mild insanities. When Italy is mad on art, the Church seems too puritanical. When England is mad on Puritanism, the Church seems too artistic. When you quarrel with us now, you class us with kingship and despotism. But when you quarreled with us first, it was because we would not accept the divine despotism of Henry VIII. The Church always seems to be behind the times, when it is really beyond the times. It is waiting till the last fad shall have seen its last summer. It keeps the key of a permanent virtue. Oh, I have heard all that, said Turnbull with genial contempt. I have heard that Christianity keeps the key of virtue, and that if you read Tom Paine you will cut your throat at Monte Carlo. It is such rubbish that I am not even angry at it. You say that Christianity is the prop of morals, but what more do you do? When a doctor attends you and could poison you with a pinch of salt, do you ask whether he is a Christian? You ask whether he is a gentleman, whether he is an M.D., anything but that. When a soldier enlists to die for his country or disgrace it, do you ask whether he is a Christian? You are more likely to ask whether he is Oxford or Cambridge at the boat race. If you think your creed essential to morals, why do you not make it a test for these things? We once did make it a test for these things, said MacIan, smiling, and then you told us that we were imposing by force a faith unsupported by argument. It seems rather hard that having first been told that our creed must be false because we did use tests, we should now be told that it must be false because we don't. But I notice that most anti-Christian arguments are in the same inconsistent style. That is all very well as a debating club answer, replied Turnbull good-humouredly. But the question still remains. Why don't you confine yourself more to Christians if Christians are the only really good men? Who talked of such folly? Asked MacIan disdainfully. Do you suppose that the Catholic Church ever held that Christians were the only good men? Why, the Catholics of the Catholic Middle Ages talked about the virtues of all the virtuous pagans until humanity was sick of the subject. No, if you really want to know what we mean when we say that Christianity has a special power of virtue, I will tell you. The Church is the only thing on earth that can perpetuate a type of virtue, and make it something more than a fashion. The thing is so plain and historical that I hardly think you will ever deny it. You cannot deny that it is perfectly possible that tomorrow morning, in Ireland or in Italy, there might appear a man not only as good, but good in exactly the same way as St. Francis of Assisi. Very well, now take the other types of human virtue, many of them splendid. The English gentleman of Elizabeth was chivalrous and idealistic. But can you stand still here in this meadow and be an English gentleman of Elizabeth? The austere republican of the 18th century, with his stern patriotism and his simple life, was a fine fellow. But have you ever seen him? Have you ever been an austere republican? Only 100 years have passed, and that volcano of revolutionary truth and valor is as cold as the mountains of the moon. And so it is, and so it will be, with the ethics which are buzzing down Fleet Street at this instant as I speak. What phrase would inspire the London clerk or workman just now? Perhaps that he is the son of the British Empire on which the sun never sets. Perhaps that he is a prop of his trades union, or a class-conscious proletarian something or other. Perhaps merely that he is a gentleman when he obviously is not. Those names and notions are all honorable. But how long will they last? Empires break, industrial conditions change, the suburbs will not last forever. What will remain? I will tell you. The Catholic saint will remain. "And suppose I don't like him?" said Turnbull. "On my theory the question is rather whether he will like you, or more probably whether he will ever have heard of you. But I grant the reasonableness of your query. You have a right, if you speak as the ordinary man, to ask if you will like the saint. But as the ordinary man you do like him. You revel in him. If you dislike him it is not because you are a nice ordinary man, but because you are, if you will excuse me, a sophisticated prig of a Fleet Street editor. That is just the funny part of it. The human race has always admired the Catholic virtues, however little it can practice them. And oddly enough, it has admired most those of them that the modern world most sharply disputes. You complain of Catholicism for setting up an ideal of virginity. It did nothing of the kind. The whole human race set up an ideal of virginity. The Greeks in Athena, the Romans in the Vestal fire, set up an ideal of virginity. What then is your real quarrel with Catholicism? Your quarrel can only be, your quarrel really only is, that Catholicism has achieved an ideal of virginity, that it is no longer a mere piece of floating poetry. But if you, and a few feverish men in top hats, running about in a street in London, choose to differ as to the ideal itself, not only from the Church but from the Parthenon whose name means virginity, from the Roman Empire which went outwards from the virgin flame, from the whole legend and tradition of Europe, from the lion who will not touch virgins, from the unicorn who respects them, and who make up together the bearers of your own national shield, from the most living and lawless of your own poets, from Massinger, who wrote The Virgin Martyr, from Shakespeare, who wrote Measure for Measure, if you in Fleet Street differ from all this human experience, does it never strike you that it may be Fleet Street that is wrong?" "No," answered Turnbull. "I trust that I am sufficiently fair-minded to canvass and consider the idea. But having considered it, I think Fleet Street is right, yes, even if the Parthenon is wrong. I think that as the world goes on, new psychological atmospheres are generated, and in these atmospheres it is possible to find delicacies and combinations which in other times would have to be represented by some ruder symbol. Every man feels the need of some element of purity in sex. Perhaps they can only typify purity as the absence of sex. You will laugh if I suggest that we may have made in Fleet Street an atmosphere in which a man can be so passionate as Sir Lancelot and as pure as Sir Galahad. But, after all, we have in the modern world erected many such atmospheres. We have, for instance, a new and imaginative appreciation of children." "Quite so," replied MacIan with a singular smile. "It has been very well put by one of the brightest of your young authors, who said, 'Unless you become as little children, ye shall in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven.' But you are quite right. There is a modern worship of children. And what, I ask you, is this modern worship of children? What, in the name of all the angels and devils, is it except a worship of virginity? Why should any one worship a thing merely because it is small or immature? No, you have tried to escape from this thing, and the very thing you point to as the goal of your escape is only the thing again. Am I wrong in saying that these things seem to be eternal?" And it was with these words that they came in sight of the great plains. They went a little way in silence, and then James Turnbull said suddenly, "But I cannot believe in the thing." MacIan answered nothing to the speech. Perhaps it is unanswerable. And indeed they scarcely spoke another word to each other all that day. End of chapter 8. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 9 of The Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 9. The Strange Lady. Moonrise with a great and growing moon opened over all those flats, making them seem flatter and larger than they were, turning them to a lake of blue light. The two companions trudged across the moonlit plain for half an hour in full silence. Then MacIan stopped suddenly and planted his sword point in the ground, like one who plants his tent pole for the night. Leaving it standing there, he clutched his black-haired skull with his great claws of hands, as was his custom when forcing the pace of his brain. Then his hands dropped again, and he spoke. "I'm sure you're thinking the same as I am," he said. "How long are we to be on this damned see-saw?" The other did not answer, but his silence seemed somehow solid as assent. And MacIan went on conversationally. Neither noticed that both had instinctively stood still before the sign of the fixed and standing sword. "It is hard to guess what God means in this business, but he means something, or the other thing, or both. Whenever we have tried to fight each other, something has stopped us. Whenever we have tried to be reconciled to each other, something has stopped us again. By the run of our luck, we have never had time to be either friends or enemies. Something always jumped out of the bushes." Turnbull nodded gravely, and glanced round at the huge and hedgeless meadow which fell away towards the horizon into a glimmering high road. "Nothing will jump out of bushes here, anyhow," he said. "That is what I meant," said MacIan, and stared steadily at the heavy hilt of his standing sword, which in the slight wind swayed on its tempered steel like some huge thistle on its stalk. "That is what I meant. We are quite alone here. I have not heard a horse-hoof or a footstep or the hoot of a train for miles. So I think we might stop here and ask for a miracle." "Oh, might we?" said the atheistic editor with a sort of gusto of disgust. "I beg your pardon," said MacIan meekly. "I forgot your prejudices." He eyed the wind-swung sword-hilt in sad meditation and resumed. "What I mean is, we might find out in this quiet place whether there really is any fate or any commandment against our enterprise. I will engage on my side, like Elijah, to accept a test from heaven. Turnbull, let us draw swords here in this moonlight and this monstrous solitude. And if here in this moonlight and solitude there happens anything to interrupt us, if it be lightning striking our sword blades or a rabbit running under our legs, I will take it as a sign from God, and we shall shake hands forever." Turnbull's mouth twitched in angry humor under his red mustache. He said, "I will wait for signs from God until I have any signs of his existence. But God, or fate, forbid that a man of scientific culture should refuse any kind of experiment." "Very well, then," said MacIan shortly. "We are more quiet here than anywhere else. Let us engage." And he plucked his sword point out of the turf. Turnbull regarded him for a second and a half with a baffling visage almost black against the moonrise. Then his hand made a sharp movement to his hip, and his sword shone in the moon. As old chess players open every game with established gambits, they opened with a thrust and parry, orthodox and even frankly ineffectual. But in MacIan's soul more formless storms were gathering, and he made a lunge or two so savage as first to surprise and then to enrage his opponent. Turnbull ground his teeth, kept his temper, and waiting for the third lunge, and the worst, had almost spitted the lunger when a shrill, small cry came from behind him, a cry such as is not made by any of the beasts that perish. Turnbull must have been more superstitious than he knew, for he stopped in the act of going forward. MacIan was brazenly superstitious, and he dropped his sword. After all, he had challenged the universe to send an interruption, and this was an interruption, whatever else it was. An instant afterwards the sharp, weak cry was repeated. This time it was certain that it was human and that it was female. MacIan stood rolling those great blue Gaelic eyes that contrasted with his dark hair. "It is the voice of God," he said again and again. "God hasn't got much of a voice," said Turnbull, who snatched at every chance of cheap profanity. "As a matter of fact, MacIan, it isn't the voice of God, but it's something a jolly sight more important. It is the voice of man, or rather of woman. So I think we'd better scoot in its direction." MacIan snatched up his fallen weapon without a word, and the two raced away towards that part of the distant road from which the cry was now constantly renewed. They had to run over a curve of country that looked smooth but was very rough, a neglected field which they soon found to be full of the tallest grasses and the deepest rabbit-holes. Moreover, that great curve of the countryside which looked so low and gentle when you glanced over it, proved to be highly precipitous when you scampered over it, and Turnbull was twice nearly flung on his face. MacIan, though much heavier, avoided such an overthrow only by having the quick and incalculable feet of the mountaineer. But both of them may be said to have leapt off a low cliff when they leapt into the road. The moonlight lay on the white road with a more naked and electric glare than on the grey-green upland, and though the scene which it revealed was complicated, it was not difficult to get its first features at a glance. A small but very neat black and yellow motor car was standing stolidly, slightly to the left of the road. A somewhat larger, light green motor car was tipped halfway into a ditch on the same side, and 4 flushed and staggering men in evening dress were tipped out of it. 3 of them were standing about the road, giving their opinions to the moon with vague but echoing violence. The 4th, however, had already advanced on the chauffeur of the black and yellow car and was threatening him with a stick. The chauffeur had risen to defend himself. By his side sat a young lady. She was sitting bolt upright, a slender and rigid figure gripping the sides of her seat, and her first few cries had ceased. She was clad in close-fitting dark costume, a mass of warm brown hair went out in 2 wings or waves on each side of her forehead, and even at that distance it could be seen that her profile was of the aquiline and eager sort, like a young falcon hardly free of the nest. Turnbull had concealed in him somewhere a fund of common sense and knowledge of the world of which he himself and his best friends were hardly aware. He was one of those who take in much of the shows of things absent-mindedly and in an irrelevant reverie. As he stood at the door of his editorial shop on Ludgate Hill and meditated on the non-existence of God, he silently absorbed a good deal of varied knowledge about the existence of men. He had come to know types by instinct and dilemmas with a glance. He saw the crux of the situation in the road, and what he saw made him redouble his pace. He knew that the men were rich, he knew that they were drunk, and he knew, what was worst of all, that they were fundamentally frightened. And he knew this also, that no common ruffian, such as attacks ladies in novels, is ever so savage and ruthless as a coarse kind of gentleman when he is really alarmed. The reason is not recondite. It is simply because the police court is not such a menacing novelty to the poor ruffian as it is to the rich. When they came within hail and heard the voices, they confirmed all Turnbull's anticipations. The man in the middle of the road was shouting in a hoarse and groggy voice that the chauffeur had smashed their car on purpose, that they must get to the Cree that evening, and that he would jolly well have to take them there. The chauffeur had mildly objected that he was driving a lady. "Oh, we'll take care of the lady," said the red-faced young man, and went off into gurgling and almost senile laughter. By the time the two champions came up, things had grown more serious. The intoxication of the man talking to the chauffeur had taken one of its perverse and cat-like jumps into mere screaming spite and rage. He lifted his stick and struck at the chauffeur, who caught hold of it, and the drunkard fell backwards, dragging him out of his seat on the car. Another of the rowdies rushed forward, booing in idiot excitement, fell over the chauffeur, and, either by accident or design, kicked him as he lay. The drunkard got to his feet again, but the chauffeur did not. The man who had kicked kept a kind of half-witted conscience or cowardice, for he stood staring at the senseless body, and murmuring words of inconsequent self-justification, making gestures with his hands as if he were arguing with somebody. But the other three, with a mere whoop and howl of victory, were boarding the car on three sides at once. It was exactly at this moment that Turnbull fell among them like one fallen from the sky. He tore one of the climbers backward by the collar, and with a hearty push sent him staggering over into the ditch upon his nose. One of the remaining two, who was too far gone to notice anything, continued to clamber ineffectually over the high back of the car, kicking and pouring forth a rivulet of soliloquy. But the other dropped at the interruption, turned upon Turnbull, and began a battering bout of fisticuffs. At the same moment the man crawled out of the ditch in a masquerade of mud and rushed at his old enemy from behind. The whole had not taken a second, and an instant after MacIan was in the midst of them. Turnbull had tossed away his sheathed sword, greatly preferring his hands, except in the avowed etiquette of the duel, for he had learned to use his hands in the old street battles of Bradlaugh. But to MacIan the sword even sheathed was a more natural weapon, and he laid about him on all sides with it as with a stick. The man who had the walking stick found his blows parried with promptitude, and a second after, to his great astonishment, found his own stick fly up in the air as by a conjuring trick, with a turn of the swordsman's wrist. Another of the revellers picked the stick out of the ditch and ran in upon MacIan, calling to his companion to assist him. "I haven't got a stick," grumbled the disarmed man, and looked vaguely about the ditch. "Perhaps," said MacIan politely, "you would like this one." With the word the drunkard found his hand that had grasped the stick suddenly twisted and empty, and the stick lay at the feet of his companion on the other side of the road. MacIan felt a faint stir behind him. The girl had risen to her feet and was leaning forward to stare at the fighters. Turnbull was still engaged in countering and pommeling with the third young man. The fourth young man was still engaged with himself, kicking his legs in helpless rotation on the back of the car and talking with melodious rationality. At length Turnbull's opponent began to back before the battery of his heavy hands, still fighting, for he was the soberest and boldest of the four. If these are annals of military glory, it is due to him to say that he need not have abandoned the conflict, only that as he backed to the edge of the ditch his foot caught in a loop of grass, and he went over in a flat and comfortable position from which it took him a considerable time to rise. By the time he had risen, Turnbull had come to the rescue of MacIan, who was at bay but belabouring his two enemies handsomely. The sight of the liberated reserve was to them like that of Blucher at Waterloo. The two set off at a sullen trot down the road, leaving even the walking stick lying behind them in the moonlight. MacIan plucked the struggling and aspiring idiot off the back of the car like a stray cat, and left him swaying unsteadily in the moon. Then he approached the front part of the car in a somewhat embarrassed manner and pulled off his cap. For some solid seconds the lady and he merely looked at each other, and MacIan had an irrational feeling of being in a picture hung on a wall. That is, he was motionless, even lifeless, and yet staringly significant, like a picture. The white moonlight on the road, when he was not looking at it, gave him a vision of the road being white with snow. The motor car, when he was not looking at it, gave him a rude impression of a captured coach in the old days of highwaymen. And he whose whole soul was with the swords and stately manners of the 18th century, he who was a Jacobite risen from the dead, had an overwhelming sense of being once more in the picture, when he had so long been out of the picture. In that short and strong silence he absorbed the lady from head to foot. He had never really looked at a human being before in his life. He saw her face and hair first, then that she had long suede gloves, then that there was a fur cap at the back of her brown hair. He might, perhaps, be excused for this hungry attention. He had prayed that some sign might come from heaven, and after an almost savage scrutiny he came to the conclusion that this one did. The lady's instantaneous arrest of speech might need more explaining, but she may well have been stunned with the squalid attack and the abrupt rescue. Yet it was she who remembered herself first, and suddenly called out with self-accusing horror, "Oh, that poor, poor man!" They both swung round abruptly and saw that Turnbull, with his recovered sword under his armpit, was already lifting the fallen chauffeur into the car. He was only stunned, and was slowly awakening, feebly waving his left arm. The lady in long gloves and the fur cap leapt out and ran rapidly towards them, only to be assured by Turnbull, who, unlike many of his school, really knew a little science when he invoked it to redeem the world. "He's all right," said he. "He's quite safe. But I'm afraid he won't be able to drive the car for half an hour or so." "I can drive the car," said the young woman in the fur cap with stony practicability. "Oh, in that case," began MacIan uneasily, and that paralyzing shyness which is a part of romance induced him to make a backward movement, as if leaving her to herself. But Turnbull was more rational than he, being more indifferent. "I don't think you ought to drive home alone, ma'am," he said, gruffly. "There seem to be a lot of rowdy parties along this road, and the man will be no use for an hour. If you will tell us where you are going, we will see you safely there and say good night." The young lady exhibited all the abrupt disturbance of a person who is not commonly disturbed. She said almost sharply, and yet with evident sincerity, "Of course I am awfully grateful to you for all you've done, and there's plenty of room if you'll come in." Turnbull, with the complete innocence of an absolutely sound motive, immediately jumped into the car, but the girl cast an eye at MacIan, who stood in the road for an instant as if rooted like a tree. Then he also tumbled his long legs into the tonneau, having that sense of degradedly diving into heaven which so many have known in so many human houses when they consented to stop for tea or were allowed to stop to supper. The slowly reviving chauffeur was set in the back seat. Turnbull and MacIan had fallen into the middle one, the lady with a steely coolness had taken the driver's seat and all the handles of that headlong machine. A moment afterwards the engine started, with a throb and leap unfamiliar to Turnbull, who had only once been in a motor during a general election, and utterly unknown to MacIan, who in his present mood thought it was the end of the world. Almost at the same instant that the car plucked itself out of the mud and whipped away up the road, the man who had been flung into the ditch rose waveringly to his feet. When he saw the car escaping, he ran after it and shouted something which, owing to the increasing distance, could not be heard. It is awful to reflect that, if his remark was valuable, it is quite lost to the world. The car shot on up and down the shining moonlit lanes, and there was no sound in it except the occasional click or catch of its machinery, for through some cause or other no soul inside it could think of a word to say. The lady symbolized her feelings, whatever they were, by urging the machine faster and faster until scattered woodlands went by them in one black blotch and heavy hills and valleys seemed to ripple under the wheels like mere waves. A little while afterwards this mood seemed to slacken, and she fell into a more ordinary pace, but still she did not speak. Turnbull, who kept a more common and sensible view of the case than anyone else, made some remark about the moonlight, but something indescribable made him also relapse into silence. All this time MacIan had been in a sort of monstrous delirium, like some fabulous hero snatched up into the moon. The difference between this experience and common experiences was analogous to that between waking life and a dream. Yet he did not feel in the least as if he were dreaming. Rather the other way. As waking was more actual than dreaming, so this seemed by another degree more actual than waking itself. But it was another life altogether, like a cosmos with a new dimension. He felt he had been hurled into some new incarnation, into the midst of new relations, wrongs and rights, with towering responsibilities and almost tragic joys which he had as yet had no time to examine. Heaven had not merely sent him a message, heaven itself had opened around him and given him an hour of its own ancient and star-shattering energy. He had never felt so much alive before, and yet he was like a man in a trance. And if you had asked him on what his throbbing happiness hung, he could only have told you that it hung on 4 or 5 visible facts, as a curtain hangs on 4 or 5 fixed nails. The fact that the lady had a little fur at her throat, the fact that the curve of her cheek was a low and lean curve and that the moonlight caught the height of her cheekbone, the fact that her hands were small but heavily gloved as they gripped the steering wheel, the fact that a white witch-light was on the road, the fact that the brisk breeze of their passage stirred and fluttered a little not only the brown hair of her head but the black fur on her cap. All these facts were to him certain and incredible, like sacraments. When they had driven half a mile farther, a big shadow was flung across the path, followed by its bulky owner, who eyed the car critically but let it pass. The silver moonlight picked out a piece or two of pewter ornament on his blue uniform, and as they went by they knew it was a sergeant of police. 300 yards farther on another policeman stepped out into the road as if to stop them, then seemed to doubt his own authority and stepped back again. The girl was a daughter of the rich, and this police suspicion, under which all the poor live day and night, stung her for the first time into speech. "What can they mean?" she cried out in a kind of temper. "This car's going like a snail." There was a short silence, and then Turnbull said, "It is certainly very odd. You are driving quietly enough." "You are driving nobly," said MacIan, and his words, which had no meaning whatever, sounded hoarse and ungainly even in his own ears. They passed the next mile and a half swiftly and smoothly. Yet among the many things which they passed in the course of it was a clump of eager policemen standing at a crossroad. As they passed, one of the policemen shouted something to the others, but nothing else happened. 800 yards farther on, Turnbull stood up suddenly in the swaying car. "My God, MacIan!" he called out, showing his first emotion of that night. "I don't believe it's the pace. It couldn't be the pace. I believe it's us." MacIan sat motionless for a few moments, and then turned up at his companion a face that was as white as the moon above it. "You may be right," he said at last. "If you are, I must tell her." "I will tell the lady if you like," said Turnbull, with his unconquered good temper. "You!" said MacIan, with a sort of sincere and instinctive astonishment. "Why should you No, I must tell her, of course." And he leant forward and spoke to the lady in the fur cap. "I am afraid, madame, that we may have got you into some trouble," he said, and even as he said it, it sounded wrong, like everything he said to this particular person in the long gloves. "The fact is," he resumed desperately, "the fact is, we are being chased by the police." Then the last flattening hammer fell upon poor Evan's embarrassment, for the fluffy brown head with the furry black cap did not turn by a section of the compass. "We are chased by the police," repeated MacIan vigorously. Then he added, as if beginning an explanation, "You see, I am a Catholic." The wind whipped back a curl of the brown hair so as to necessitate a new theory of aesthetics touching the line of the cheekbone. But the head did not turn. "You see," began MacIan again blunderingly, "this gentleman wrote in his newspaper that Our Lady was a common woman, a bad woman, and so we agreed to fight, and we were fighting quite a little time ago, but that was before we saw you." The young lady driving her car had half turned her face to listen, and it was not a reverent or a patient face that she showed him. Her Norman nose was tilted a trifle too high upon the slim stock of her neck and body. When MacIan saw that arrogant and uplifted profile penciled plainly against the moonshine, he accepted an ultimate defeat. He had expected the angels to despise him if he were wrong, but not to despise him so much as this. "You see," said the stumbling spokesman, "I was angry with him when he insulted the Mother of God, and I asked him to fight a duel with me, but the police are all trying to stop it." Nothing seemed to waver or flicker in the fair young falcon profile, and it only opened its lips to say, after a silence, "I thought people in our time were supposed to respect each other's religion." Under the shadow of that arrogant face MacIan could only fall back on the obvious answer. "But what about a man's irreligion?" The face only answered, "Well, you ought to be more broad-minded." If anyone else in the world had said the words, MacIan would have snorted with his equine neigh of scorn. But in this case he seemed knocked down by a superior simplicity, as if his eccentric attitude were rebuked by the innocence of a child. He could not dissociate anything that this woman said or did or wore from an idea of spiritual rarity and virtue. Like most others under the same elemental passion, his soul was at present soaked in ethics. He could have applied moral terms to the material objects of her environment. If someone had spoken of her generous ribbon, or her chivalrous gloves, or her merciful shoe buckle, it would not have seemed to him nonsense. He was silent, and the girl went on in a lower key, as if she were momentarily softened and a little saddened too. "It won't do, you know," she said. "You can't find out the truth in that way. There are such heaps of churches and people thinking different things nowadays, and they all think they are right. My uncle was a Swedenborgian." MacIan sat with bowed head, listening hungrily to her voice but hardly to her words, and seeing his great world drama grow smaller and smaller before his eyes until it was no bigger than a child's toy theatre. "The time's gone by for all that," she went on. "You can't find out the real thing like that, if there is really anything to find." And she sighed rather drearily, for, like many of the women of our wealthy class, she was old and broken in thought, though young and clean enough in her emotions. "Our object," said Turnbull shortly, "is to make an effective demonstration." And after that word MacIan looked at his vision again and found it smaller than ever. "It would be in the newspapers, of course," said the girl. "People read the newspapers, but they don't believe them or anything else, I think." And she sighed again. She drove in silence a third of a mile before she added, as if completing the sentence, "Anyhow, the whole thing's quite absurd." "I don't think," began Turnbull, "that you quite realize Hullo! 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 What's this?" The amateur chauffeur had been forced to bring the car to a staggering stoppage, for a file of fat, blue policemen made a wall across the way. A sergeant came to the side and touched his peaked cap to the lady. "Beg your pardon, miss," he said with some embarrassment, for he knew her for a daughter of a dominant house, "but we have reason to believe that the gentlemen in your car are—" and he hesitated for a polite phrase. "I am Evan MacIan," said that gentleman, and stood up in a sort of gloomy pomp, not wholly without a touch of the sulks of a schoolboy. "Yes, we will get out, sergeant," said Turnbull more easily. "My name is James Turnbull. We must not incommode the lady." "What are you taking them up for?" asked the young woman, looking straight in front of her along the road. "It's under the new Act," said the sergeant, almost apologetically, "incurable disturbers of the peace." "What will happen to them?" she asked, with the same frigid clearness. "Westgate Adult Reformatory," he replied briefly. "Until when?" "Until they are cured," said the official. "Very well, sergeant," said the young lady with a sort of tired common sense. "I am sure I don't want to protect criminals or go against the law, but I must tell you that these gentlemen have done me a considerable service. You won't mind drawing your men a little farther off while I say good night to them. Men like that always misunderstand." The sergeant was profoundly disquieted from the beginning at the mere idea of arresting anyone in the company of a great lady. To refuse one of her minor requests was quite beyond his courage. The police fell back to a few yards behind the car. Turnbull took up the two swords that were their only luggage, the swords that, after so many half-duels, they were now to surrender at last. MacIan, the blood thundering in his brain at the thought of that instant of farewell, bent over, fumbled at the handle, and flung open the door to get out. But he did not get out. He did not get out because it is dangerous to jump out of a car when it is going at full speed. And the car was going at full speed because the young lady, without turning her head or so much as saying a syllable, had driven down a handle that made the engine plunge forward like a buffalo and then fly over the landscape like a greyhound. The police made one rush to follow, and then dropped so grotesque and hopeless a chase. Away in the vanishing distance they could see the sergeant furiously making notes. The open door, still left loose on its hinges, swung and banged quite crazily as they went whizzing up one road and down another. Nor did MacIan sit down. He stood up stunned and yet staring, as he would have stood up at the trumpet on the last day. A black dot in the distance sprang up a tall black forest, swallowed them and spat them out again at the other end. A railway bridge grew larger and larger till it leapt upon their backs bellowing, and it was in turn left behind. Avenues of poplars on both sides of the road chased each other like the figures in a zoetrope. Now and then with a shock and rattle they went through sleeping moonlit villages, which must have stirred an instant in their sleep as at the passing of a fugitive earthquake. Sometimes in an outlying house a light in one erratic, unexpected window would give them a nameless hint of the hundred human secrets which they left behind them with their dust. Sometimes even a slouching rustic would be afoot on the road and would look after them as after a flying phantom. But still MacIan stood up staring at earth and heaven, and still the door he had flung open flapped loose like a flag. Turnbull, after a few minutes of dumb amazement, had yielded to the healthiest element in his nature, and gone off into uncontrollable fits of laughter. The girl had not stirred an inch. After another half-mile that seemed a mere flash, Turnbull leant over and locked the door. Evan staggered at last into his seat and hid his throbbing head in his hands. And still the car flew on and its driver sat inflexible and silent. The moon had already gone down, and the whole darkness was faintly troubled with twilight and the first movement of beasts and fowls. It was that mysterious moment when light is coming as if it were something unknown whose nature one could not guess, a mere alteration in everything. They looked at the sky and it seemed as dark as ever, then they saw the black shape of a tower or tree against it and knew that it was already grey. Save that they were driving southward and had certainly passed the longitude of London, they knew nothing of their direction. But Turnbull, who had spent a year on the Hampshire coast in his youth, began to recognize the unmistakable but quite indescribable villages of the English south. Then a white witch fire began to burn between the black stems of the fir trees, and, like so many things in nature, though not in books on evolution, the daybreak, when it did come, came much quicker than one would think. The gloomy heavens were ripped up and rolled away like a scroll, revealing splendors, as the car went roaring up the curve of a great hill, and above them and black against the broadening light there stood one of those crouching and fantastic trees that are the first signals of the sea. End of chapter 9. Recording by Trisha G. Of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G. K. Chesterton. Chapter 10. The swords rejoined. As they came over the hill and down on the other side of it, it is not too much to say that the whole universe of God opened over them and under them, like a thing unfolding to 5 times its size. Almost under their feet opened the enormous sea, at the bottom of a steep valley which fell down into a bay, and the sea under their feet blazed at them almost as lustrous and almost as empty as the sky. The sunrise opened above them like some cosmic explosion, shining and shattering and yet silent, as if the world were blown to pieces without a sound. Round the rays of the victorious sun swept a sort of rainbow of confused and conquered colors, brown and blue and green and flaming rose color, as though gold were driving before it all the colors of the world. The lines of the landscape down which they sped were the simple, strict, yet swerving, lines of a rushing river, so that it was almost as if they were being sucked down in a huge still whirlpool. Turnbull had some such feeling, for he spoke for the first time for many hours. "If we go down at this rate we shall be over the sea cliff," he said. "How glorious!" said MacIan. When, however, they had come into the wide hollow at the bottom of that landslide, the car took a calm and graceful curve along the side of the sea, melted into the fringe of a few trees, and quietly, yet astonishingly, stopped. A belated light was burning in the broad morning in the window of a sort of lodge, or gatekeeper's cottage, and the girl stood up in the car and turned her splendid face to the sun. Evan seemed startled by the stillness, like one who had been born amid sound and speed. He wavered on his long legs as he stood up, he pulled himself together, and the only consequence was that he trembled from head to foot. Turnbull had already opened the door on his side and jumped out. The moment he had done so the strange young woman had one more mad movement, and deliberately drove the car a few yards farther. Then she got out with an almost cruel coolness and began pulling off her long gloves and almost whistling. "You can leave me here," she said quite casually, as if they had met 5 minutes before. "That is the lodge of my father's place. Please come in if you like, but I understand that you had some business." Evan looked at that lifted face and found it merely lovely. He was far too much of a fool to see that it was working with a final fatigue and that its austerity was agony. He was even fool enough to ask it a question. "Why did you save us?" he said quite humbly. The girl tore off one of her gloves as if she were tearing off her hand. "Oh, I don't know," she said bitterly. "Now I come to think of it, I can't imagine." Evan's thoughts, that had been piled up to the morning star, abruptly let him down with a crash into the very cellars of the emotional universe. He remained in a stunned silence for a long time, and that, if he had only known, was the wisest thing that he could possibly do at the moment. Indeed, the silence and the sunrise had their healing effect, for when the extraordinary lady spoke again, her tone was more friendly and apologetic. "I'm not really ungrateful," she said. "It was very good of you to save me from those men." "But why?" repeated the obstinate and dazed MacIan. "Why did you save us from the other men? I mean the policemen?" The girl's great brown eyes were lit up with a flash that was at once final desperation and the loosening of some private and passionate reserve. "Oh, God knows!" she cried. "God knows that if there is a God he had turned his big back on everything. God knows I have had no pleasure in my life, though I am pretty and young and father has plenty of money. And then people come and tell me that I ought to do things, and I do them, and it's all drivel. They want you to do work among the poor, which means reading Ruskin and feeling self-righteous in the best room in a poor tenement; or to help some cause or other, which always means bundling people out of crooked houses in which they've always lived into straight houses in which they often die. And all the time you have inside only the horrid irony of your own empty head and empty heart. I am to give to the unfortunate when my whole misfortune is that I have nothing to give. I am to teach when I believe nothing at all that I was taught. I am to save the children from death, and I am not even certain that I should not be better dead. I suppose if I actually saw a child drowning I should save it. But that would be from the same motive from which I have saved you or destroyed you, whichever it is that I have done." "What was the motive?" asked Evan in a low voice. "My motive is too big for my mind," answered the girl. Then after a pause, as she stared with a rising color at the glittering sea, she said, "It can't be described, and yet I am trying to describe it. It seems to me not only that I am unhappy, but that there is no way of being happy. Father is not happy, though he is a member of Parliament." She paused a moment, and added with a ghost of a smile, "Nor Aunt Mabel, though a man from India has told her the secret of all creeds. But I may be wrong, there may be a way out, and for one stark insane second I felt that, after all, you had got the way out and that was why the world hated you. You see, if there were a way out, it would be sure to be something that looked very queer." Evan put his hand to his forehead and began stumblingly, "Yes, I suppose we do seem—" "Oh, yes, you look queer enough," she said with ringing sincerity. "You'll be all the better for a wash and brush up." "You forget our business, madame," said Evan in a shaking voice. "We have no concern but to kill each other." "Well, I shouldn't be killed looking like that if I were you," she replied with inhuman honesty. Evan stood and rolled his eyes in masculine bewilderment. Then came the final change in this Proteus, and she put out both her hands for an instant and said in a low tone on which he lived for days and nights, "Don't you understand that I did not dare to stop you? What you are doing is so mad that it may be quite true. Somehow one can never really manage to be an atheist." Turnbull stood staring at the sea, but his shoulders showed that he heard, and after 1 minute he turned his head. But the girl had only brushed Evan's hand with hers and had fled up the dark alley by the lodge gate. Evan stood rooted upon the road, literally like some heavy statue hewn there in the age of the Druids. It seemed impossible that he should ever move. Turnbull grew restless with this rigidity, and at last, after calling his companion twice or thrice, went up and clapped him impatiently on one of his big shoulders. Evan winced and leapt away from him with a repulsion which was not the hate of an unclean thing nor the dread of a dangerous one, but was a spasm of awe and separation from something from which he was now sundered as by the sword of God. He did not hate the atheist. It is possible that he loved him. But Turnbull was now something more dreadful than an enemy. He was a thing sealed and devoted, a thing now hopelessly doomed to be either a corpse or an executioner. "What is the matter with you?" asked Turnbull, with his hearty hand still in the air, and yet he knew more about it than his innocent action would allow. "James," said Evan, speaking like one under strong bodily pain, "I asked for God's answer, and I have got it in my vitals. He knows how weak I am, and that I might forget the peril of the faith, forget the face of Our Lady. Yes, even with your blow upon her cheek. But the honour of this earth has just this about it, that it can make a man's heart like iron. I am from the Lords of the Isles, and I dare not be a mere deserter. Therefore God has tied me by the chain of my worldly place and word, and there is nothing but fighting now." "I think I understand you," said Turnbull, "but you say everything tail foremost." "She wants us to do it," said Evan, in a voice crushed with passion. "She has hurt herself so that we might do it. She has left her good name and her good sleep and all her habits and dignity flung away on the other side of England, in the hope that she may hear of us and that we have broken some hole into heaven." "I thought I knew what you mean," said Turnbull, biting his beard. "It does seem as if we ought to do something after all she has done this night." "I never liked you so much before," said MacIan in bitter sorrow. As he spoke, 3 solemn footmen came out of the lodge gate and assembled to assist the chauffeur to his room. The mere sight of them made the 2 wanderers flee as from a too frightful incongruity, and before they knew where they were well upon the grassy ledge of England that overlooks the Channel. Evan said suddenly, "Will they let me see her in heaven once in 1,000 ages?" and addressed the remark to the editor of the Atheist, as on which he would be likely or qualified to answer. But no answer came, a silence sank between the two. Turnbull strode sturdily to the edge of the cliff and looked out, his companion following, somewhat more shaken by his recent agitation. "If that's the view you take," said Turnbull, "and I don't say you are wrong, I think I know where we shall be best off for the business. As it happens, I know this part of the south coast pretty well, and unless I am mistaken, there's a way down the cliff just here which will land us on a stretch of firm sand where no one is likely to follow us." The Highlander made a gesture of assent and came also almost to the edge of the precipice. The sunrise, which was broadening over sea and shore, was one of those rare and splendid ones in which there seems to be no mist or doubt, and nothing but a universal clarification more and more complete. All the colors were transparent. It seemed like a triumphant prophecy of some perfect world where everything being innocent will be intelligible, a world where even our bodies, so to speak, may be as of burning glass. Such a world is faintly though fiercely figured in the colored windows of Christian architecture. The sea that lay before them was like a pavement of emerald, bright and almost brittle. The sky against which its strict horizon hung was almost absolutely white, except that close to the skyline, like scarlet braids on the hem of a garment, lay strings of flaky cloud of so gleaming and gorgeous a red that they seemed cut out of some strange blood-red celestial metal, of which the mere gold of this earth is but a drab yellow imitation. "The hand of heaven is still pointing," muttered the man of superstition to himself, "and now it is a blood-red hand." The cool voice of his companion cut in upon his monologue, calling to him from a little farther along the cliff to tell him that he had found the ladder of descent. It began as a steep and somewhat greasy path, which then tumbled down 20 or 30 feet in the form of a fall of rough stone steps. After that there was a rather awkward drop onto a ledge of stone, and then the journey was undertaken easily and even elegantly by the remains of an ornamental staircase, such as might have belonged to some long disused watering place. All the time that the two travelers sank from stage to stage of this downward journey there closed over their heads living bridges and caverns of the most varied foliage, all of which grew greener, redder, or more golden in the growing sunlight of the morning. Life, too, of the more moving sort rose at the sun on every side of them. Birds whirred and fluttered in the undergrowth as if imprisoned in green cages. Other birds were shaken up in great clouds from the tree-tops, as if they were blossoms detached and scattered up to heaven. Animals which Turnbull was too much of a Londoner and MacIan too much of a Northerner to know slipped by among the tangle or ran pattering up the tree-trunks. Both the men, according to their several creeds, felt the full thunder of the psalm of life as they had never heard it before. MacIan felt God the Father benignant in all his energies, and Turnbull that ultimate anonymous energy, that natura naturans, which is the whole theme of Lucretius. It was down this clamorous ladder of life that they went down to die. They broke out upon a brown semicircle of sand, so free from human imprint as to justify Turnbull's profession. They strode out upon it, stuck their swords in the sand, and had a pause too important for speech. Turnbull eyed the coast curiously for a moment, like one awakening memories of childhood. Then he said abruptly, like a man remembering somebody's name, "But, of course, we shall be better off still round the corner of Cragness Point. Nobody ever comes there at all." And picking up his sword again, he began striding towards a big bluff of the rocks which stood out upon their left. MacIan followed him round the corner and found himself in what was certainly an even finer fencing court, of flat, firm sand, enclosed on 3 sides by white walls of rock, and on the 4th by the green wall of the advancing sea. "We are quite safe here," said Turnbull, and, to the others' surprise, flung himself down, sitting on the brown beach. "You see, I was brought up near here," he explained. "I was sent from Scotland to stop with my aunt. It is highly probable that I may die here. Do you mind if I light a pipe?" "Of course, do whatever you like," said MacIan with a choking voice, and he went and walked alone by himself along the wet, glistening sands. 10 minutes afterwards he came back again, white with his own whirlwind of emotions. Turnbull was quite cheerful, and was knocking out the end of his pipe. "You see, we have to do it," said MacIan. "She tied us to it." "Of course, my dear fellow," said the other, and leapt up as lightly as a monkey. They took their places gravely in the very centre of the great square of sand, as if they had thousands of spectators. Before saluting, MacIan, who, being a mystic, was 1 inch nearer to nature, cast his eye round the huge framework of their heroic folly. The 3 walls of rock all leant a little outward, though at various angles; but this impression was exaggerated in the direction of the incredible by the heavy load of living trees and thickets which each wall wore on its top like a huge shock of hair. On all that luxurious crest of life the risen and victorious sun was beating, burnishing it all like gold, and every bird that rose with that sunrise caught a light like a star upon it, like the dove of the Holy Spirit. Imaginative life had never so much crowded upon MacIan. He felt that he could write whole books about the feelings of a single bird. He felt that for 2 centuries he would not tire of being a rabbit. He was in the palace of life, of which the very tapestries and curtains were alive. Then he recovered himself and remembered his affairs. Both men saluted, and iron rang upon iron. It was exactly at the same moment that he realized that his enemy's left ankle was encircled with a ring of salt water that had crept up to his feet. "What is the matter?" said Turnbull, stopping an instant, for he had grown used to every movement of his extraordinary fellow-traveller's face. MacIan glanced again at that silver anklet of sea-water, and then looked beyond at the next promontory round which a deep sea was boiling and leaping. Then he turned and looked back, and saw heavy foam being shaken up to heaven about the base of Cragness Point. "The sea has cut us off," he said curtly. "I have noticed it," said Turnbull with equal sobriety. "What view do you take of the development?" Evan threw away his weapon, and, as his custom was, imprisoned his big head in his hands. Then he let them fall and said, "Yes, I know what it means, and I think it is the fairest thing. It is the finger of God, red as blood, still pointing. But now it points to 2 graves." There was a space filled with the sound of the sea, and then MacIan spoke again in a voice pathetically reasonable. "You see, we both saved her, and she told us both to fight, and it would not be just that either should fail and fall alone, while the other—" "You mean," said Turnbull in a voice surprisingly soft and gentle, "that there is something fine about fighting in a place where even the conqueror must die?" "Oh, you have got it right, you have got it right!" cried out Evan, in an extraordinary childish ecstasy. "Oh, I'm sure that you really believe in God." Turnbull answered not a word, but only took up his fallen sword. For the 3rd time Evan MacIan looked at those 3 sides of English cliff hung with their noisy load of life. He had been at a loss to understand the almost ironical magnificence of all those teeming creatures and tropical colours and smells that smoked happily to heaven, but now he knew that he was in the closed court of death, and that all the gates were sealed. He drank in the last green and the last red and the last gold, those unique and indescribable things of God, as a man drains good wine at the bottom of his glass. Then he turned and saluted his enemy once more, and the 2 stood up and fought till the foam flowed over their knees. Then MacIan stepped backward suddenly with a splash and held up his hand. "Turnbull," he cried, "I can't help it. Fair fighting is more even than promises, and this is not fair fighting." "What the deuce do you mean?" cried the other, staring. "I've only just thought of it," cried Evan brokenly. "We're very well matched. It may go on a good time. The tide is coming up fast, and I'm a foot and a half taller. You'll be washed away like seaweed before it's above my breeches. I'll not fight foul for all the girls and angels in the universe." "Will you oblige me," said Turnbull, with staring grey eyes and a voice of distinct and violent politeness, "will you oblige me by jolly well minding your own business? Just you stand up and fight, and we'll see who will be washed away like seaweed. You wanted to finish this fight, and you shall finish it, or I'll denounce you as a coward to the whole of that assembled company." Evan looked very doubtful and offered a somewhat wavering weapon, but he was quickly brought back to his senses by his opponent's sword point, which shot past him, shaving his shoulder by a hair. By this time the waves were well up Turnbull's thigh, and what was worse, they were beginning to roll and break heavily around them. MacIan parried this first lunge perfectly, the next less perfectly, the third in all human probability he would not have parried at all, the Christian champion would have been pinned like a butterfly, and the atheistic champion left to drown like a rat, with such consolation as his view of the cosmos afforded him. But just as Turnbull launched his heaviest stroke, the sea, in which he stood up to his hips, launched a yet heavier one. A wave breaking beyond the others smote him heavily like a hammer of water. One leg gave way, he was swung round and sucked into the retreating sea, still gripping his sword. MacIan put his sword between his teeth and plunged after his disappearing enemy. He had the sense of having the whole universe on top of him as crest after crest struck him down. It seemed to him quite a cosmic collapse, as if all the seven heavens were falling on him one after the other. But he got hold of the atheist's left leg, and he did not let go. After some 10 minutes of foam and frenzy, in which all the senses at once seemed blasted by the sea, Evan found himself laboriously swimming on a low green swell, with the sword still in his teeth, and the editor of the Atheist still under his arm. What he was going to do he had not even the most glimmering idea, so he merely kept his grip and swam somehow with one hand. He ducked instinctively as there bulked above him a big black wave, much higher than any that he had seen. Then he saw that it was hardly the shape of any possible wave. Then he saw that it was a fisherman's boat, and, leaping upward, caught hold of the bow. The boat pitched forward with its stern in the air for just as much time as was needed to see that there was nobody in it. After a moment or two of desperate clambering, however, there were 2 people in it, Mr. Evan MacIan, panting and sweating, and Mr. James Turnbull, uncommonly close to being drowned. After 10 minutes' aimless tossing in the empty fishing boat, he recovered, however, stirred, stretched himself, and looked round on the rolling waters. Then, while taking no notice of the streams of salt water that were pouring from his hair, beard, coat, boots, and trousers, he carefully wiped the wet off his sword blade to preserve it from the possibilities of rust. MacIan found 2 oars in the bottom of the deserted boat and began somewhat drearily to row. A rainy twilight was clearing to cold silver over the moaning sea, when the battered boat that had rolled and drifted almost aimlessly all night came within sight of land, though of land which looked almost as lost and savage as the waves. All night there had been but little lifting in the leaden sea, only now and then the boat had been heaved up, as on a huge shoulder which slipped from under it. Such occasional sea quakes came probably from the swell of some steamer that had passed it in the dark; otherwise the waves were harmless though restless. But it was piercingly cold, and there was, from time to time, a splutter of rain like the splutter of the spray, which seemed almost to freeze as it fell. MacIan, more at home than his companion in this quite barbarous and elemental sort of adventure, had rowed toilsomely with the heavy oars whenever he saw anything that looked like land, but for the most part had trusted with grim transcendentalism to wind and tide. Among the implements of their first outfit the brandy alone had remained to him, and he gave it to his freezing companion in quantities which greatly alarmed that temperate Londoner. But MacIan came from the cold seas and mists where a man can drink a tumbler of raw whiskey in a boat without it making him wink. When the Highlander began to pull really hard upon the oars, Turnbull craned his dripping red head out of the boat to see the goal of his exertions. It was a sufficiently uninviting one, nothing so far as could be seen but a steep and shelving bank of shingle, made of loose little pebbles such as children like, but slanting up higher than a house. On the top of the mound, against the skyline, stood up the brown skeleton of some broken fence or breakwater. With the grey and watery dawn crawling up behind it, the fence really seemed to say to our philosophic adventurers that they had come at last to the other end of nowhere. Bent by necessity to his labour, MacIan managed the heavy boat with real power and skill, and when at length he ran it up on a smoother part of the slope, it caught and held so that they could clamber out, not sinking farther than their knees into the water and the shingle. A foot or two farther up their feet found the beach firmer, and a few moments afterwards they were leaning on the ragged breakwater and looking back at the sea they had escaped. They had a dreary walk across wastes of grey shingle in the grey dawn before they began to come within hail of human fields or roads. Nor had they any notion of what fields or roads they would be. Their boots were beginning to break up and the confusion of stones tried them severely, so that they were glad to lean on their swords as if they were the staves of pilgrims. MacIan thought vaguely of a weird ballad of his own country which describes the soul in purgatory as walking on a plain full of sharp stones, and only saved by its own charities upon earth. If thou gavest hosen and shoon every night and all, sit thee down and put them on, and Christ receive thy soul. Turnbull had no such lyrical meditations, but he was in an even worse temper. At length they came to a pale ribbon of road, edged by a shelf of rough and almost colourless turf, and a few feet up the slope there stood grey and weather-stained one of those big wayside crucifixes which are seldom seen except in Catholic countries. MacIan put his hand to his head and found that his bonnet was not there. Turnbull gave one glance at the crucifix, a glance at once sympathetic and bitter, in which was concentrated the whole of Swinburne's poem on the same occasion. O hidden face of man, whereover the years have woven a viewless veil, if thou wert verily man's lover, what did thy love or blood avail? Thy blood the priests mix poison of, and in gold shekels coin they love. Then, leaving MacIan in his attitude of prayer, Turnbull began to look right and left very sharply, like one looking for something. Suddenly, with a little cry, he saw it and ran forward. A few yards from them, along the road, a lean and starved sort of hedge came pitifully to an end. Caught upon its prickly angle, however, there was a very small and very dirty scrap of paper that might have hung there for months, since it escaped from someone tearing up a letter or making a spill out of a newspaper. Turnbull snatched at it and found that it was the corner of a printed page, very coarsely printed, like a cheap novelette, and just large enough to contain the words, Et se eliki. "Hurrah!" cried Turnbull, waving his fragment. "We are safe at last! We are free at last! We are somewhere better than England or Eden or Paradise! MacIan, we are in the land of the duel!" "Where do you say?" said the other, looking at him heavily and with knitted brows, like one almost dazed with the grey doubts of desolate twilight and drifting sea. "We are in France!" cried Turnbull, with a voice like a trumpet. "In the land where things really happen. Tout arrive en France. We arrive in France. Look at this little message," and he held out the scrap of paper. "There's an omen for you superstitious hill folk. C'est elle qui, my oui, c'est elle qui sauvera encore le monde." "France!" repeated MacIan, and his eyes awoke again in his head like large lamps lighted. "Yes, France!" said Turnbull, and all the rhetorical part of him came to the top, his face growing as red as his hair. "France, that has always been in rebellion for liberty and reason. France, that has always assailed superstition with the club of Rabelais or the rapier of Voltaire. France, at whose first council table sits the sublime figure of Julian the Apostate. France, where a man said only the other day those splendid unanswerable words," with a superb gesture, "we have extinguished in heaven those lights that men shall never light again." "No," said MacIan, with a voice that shook with controlled passion. "But France, which was taught by St. Bernard and led to war by Joan of Arc; France that made the Crusades; France that saved the Church and scattered the heresies by the mouths of Bossuet and Massillon; France, which shows today the conquering march of Catholicism, as brain after brain surrenders to it, Brunetière, Coppet, Hauptmann, Barré, Bourget, Lemaitre." "France," asserted Turnbull with a sort of rollicking self-exaggeration very unusual with him, "France, which is one torrent of splendid scepticism from Abelard to Anatole, France." "France," said MacIan, "which is one cataract of clear faith from St. Louis to Our Lady of Lourdes." "France, at least," cried Turnbull, throwing up his sword in schoolboy triumph, "in which these things are thought about and fought about. France, where reason and religion clash in one continual tournament. France, above all, where men understand the pride and passion which have plucked our blades from their scabbards. Here, at least, we shall not be chased and spied on by sickly parsons and greasy policemen, because we wish to put our lives on the game. Courage, my friend, we have come to the country of honour." MacIan did not even notice the incongruous phrase, "my friend," but nodding again and again, drew his sword and flung the scabbard far behind him in the road. "Yes," he cried in a voice of thunder, "we shall fight here, and he shall look on at it." Turnbull glanced at the crucifix with a sort of scowling good humour, and then said, "He may look and see his cross defeated." "The cross cannot be defeated," said MacIan, "for it is defeat." A second afterwards the two bright, bloodthirsty weapons made the sign of the cross in horrible parody upon each other. They had not touched each other twice, however, when upon the hill, above the crucifix, there appeared another horrible parody of its shape, the figure of a man who appeared for an instant waving his outspread arms. He had vanished in an instant, but MacIan, whose fighting face was set that way, had seen the shape momentarily, but quite photographically. And while it was like a comic repetition of the cross, it was also, in that place and hour, something more incredible. It had been only instantaneously on the retina of his eye; but unless his eye and mind were going mad together, the figure was that of an ordinary London policeman. He tried to concentrate his senses on the sword play, but one half of his brain was wrestling with the puzzle: the apocalyptic and almost seraphic apparition of a stout constable out of Clapham on top of a dreary and deserted hill in France. He did not, however, have to puzzle long. Before the duellists had exchanged half a dozen passes, the big blue policeman appeared once more on the top of the hill, a palpable monstrosity in the eye of heaven. He was waving only one arm now, and seemed to be shouting directions. At the same moment a mass of blue blocked the corner of the road behind the small, smart figure of Turnbull, and a small company of policemen in the English uniform came up at a kind of half-military double. Turnbull saw the stare of consternation in his enemy's face and swung round to share its cause. When he saw it, cool as he was, he staggered back. "What the devil are you doing here?" he cried out in a high, shrill voice of authority, like one who finds a tramp in his own larder. "Well, sir," said the sergeant in command, with that sort of heavy civility shown only to the evidently guilty, "seems to me we might ask what you are doing here." "We are having an affair of honour," said Turnbull, as if it were the most rational thing in the world. "If the French police like to interfere, let them interfere. But why the blue blazes should you interfere, you great blue blundering sausages?" "I'm afraid, sir," said the sergeant with restraint, "I'm afraid I don't quite follow you." "I mean, why don't the French police take this up if it's got to be taken up? I always heard that they were spry enough in their own way." "Well, sir," said the sergeant reflectively, "you see, sir, the French police don't take this up, well, because you see, sir, this ain't France. This is His Majesty's dominions,
Same as 'Ampstead 'Eath." "Not France?" repeated Turnbull, with a sort of dull incredulity. "No, sir," said the sergeant, "though most of the people talk French. This is the island called St. Loup, sir, an island in the Channel. We've been sent down specially from London, as you are such specially distinguished criminals, if you'll allow me to say so. Which reminds me to warn you that anything you say may be used against you at your trial." "Quite so," said Turnbull, and lurched suddenly against the sergeant, so as to tip him over the edge of the road with a crash into the shingle below. Then leaving MacIan and the policemen equally and instantaneously nailed to the road, he ran a little way along it, leapt off on to a part of the beach, which he had found in his journey to be firmer, and went across it with a clatter of pebbles. His sudden calculation was successful. The police, unacquainted with the various levels of the loose beach, tried to overtake him by the shorter cut, and found themselves, being heavy men, almost up to their knees in shoals of slippery shingle. Two who had been slower with their bodies were quicker with their minds, and seeing Turnbull's trick, ran along the edge of the road after him. Then MacIan finally awoke, and leaving half his sleeve in the grip of the only man who tried to hold him, took the two policemen in the small of their backs with the impetus of a cannon ball, and, sending them also flat among the stones, went tearing after his twin defier of the law. As they were both good runners, the start they had gained was decisive. They dropped over a high breakwater farther on upon the beach, turned sharply, and scrambled up a line of ribbed rocks, crowned with a thicket, crawled through it, scratching their hands and faces, and dropped into another road, and there found that they could slacken their speed into a steady trot. In all this desperate dart and scramble they still kept hold of their drawn swords, which now, indeed, in the vigorous phrase of Bunyan, seemed almost to grow out of their hands. They had run another half-mile or so when it became apparent that they were entering a sort of scattered village. One or two whitewashed cottages and even a shop had appeared along the side of the road. Then, for the first time, Turnbull twisted round his red head to get a glimpse of his companion, who was a foot or two behind, and remarked abruptly, "Mr. MacIan, we've been going the wrong way to work all along. We're traced everywhere, because everybody knows about us. It's as if one went about with Kruger's beard on Mafeking night." "What do you mean?" said MacIan innocently. "I mean," said Turnbull, with steady conviction, "that what we want is a little diplomacy, and I'm going to buy some in a shop." Chapter 11.